Here we have a model sent in by Gerickos Art. Jericho says, hey, here is my 3D adaptation of Ayran Oberto's Joker. I'd love to hear your crits on the adaptation of my work. I've actually took liberties on the hair, but it was probably a bad decision because they don't show the speed sensation that the reference has. I would have to agree. Here are the crits I had from Ayran Oberto, and I totally agree with what he said. Oh, awesome. You already got some info here. So Ayran said, the two things I saw right away is the hair and the mouth. Yeah, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. The hair should feel punched over the skull with movement to give the sensation of him kind of coming toward us in high speed. And the jaw on your model looks kind of falling, so it looks like a drop jaw instead of a crazy smile. And then back to Jericho here, he says, another thing, try to give, or no wait, this is still him, I think. Try to give a soft bouncing light on the shadow area so the left side of the face shows more detail. Here are my final renders in case you'd like to compare them to the reference. We can open up a quick link here to Jericho's final there. Antoni Destialerebis. Beautiful. Alright, so in terms of comparison to the 2D here, yeah, there's definitely a lot of stuff going on with the jaw, and yeah, we'll talk about all of it. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to work my way up from the bottom to the top. Obviously, the focus here was more just on the face, as a lot of this is very unfinished. But if you want to get as close to possible here, in terms of the form here, it feels very awkward and just kind of stuck on in a hurry. I would spend more time on, this kind of information, and instead of doing this just kind of hand sculpting, because this is so flat and awkward and not what we would expect to see from our character's body, I would maybe recommend just sculpting in the block out of your character's base form there. And then after you do that, I would consider, sculpting the shirt and just getting you could even just extract a really basic form. And then once you get to the actual seam lines here, what I would recommend doing is using some curve brushes that can give you some, let's see, 5 million polys, that's pretty high. Let's just use, what do you got here? We'll do this. Use some, some curve brushes, and I have some extra settings on here from a previous critique, so we'll just adjust that a little bit so that you can start using some curve brushes to create your basic seam line. As you can see, there's some pretty clean lines flowing up from here, and that's what we would expect from clothing as well. We wouldn't expect this to be quite so messy and all over the place. So I would say kind of reassess some of the form down there, instead of making this feel so weird and kind of just trying to match the shape of this curve. Really what's happening here is that, he's leaning forward and he's got this one shoulder dipped down quite a bit. At least that's kind of the read that I'm getting from that simple line based off of the curve of the form flowing that way. So I'd try to imitate that a little bit more closely. And then for the actual face, we'll kind of work our way up. Like I said, a lot of this is pretty unfinished, but just some stuff that immediately catches my eye. Your nose is way, way softer than what we see in the reference. Much, much softer. And the actual shape is just incorrect. A lot of the shapes here are just incorrect in terms of how sharp and angular this face actually is. I would say take some time to exaggerate some of this flowing around the brow. It looks like the brow is a little bit more heavy than what you have going on here. This is pretty high res. I would also consider using some subdivision levels as you're sculpting. If you're not familiar with that workflow, I think that might help you out quite a bit. Let's see, so kind of coming here, wrapping around. There's definitely a highlight here, kind of exaggerating that cheekbone a bit more, wrapping up and around the face. Like I said, the shape of the nose is just incorrect. If we look at the actual point where this transitions, we can see from the tip of the nose. So I started to pull that out. We didn't finish it, but it's kind of like a bird beak almost. Point, wrap around, 1, 2. So point, wrap around, 1, 2. Whereas yours is more of just a soft form wrap. So to start kind of pushing that in the correct direction, just spend some time and sit here for, a few minutes. Start pinching up some of this form, starting to get the directionality to change. And I'll just use my move brush and just kind of push and pull some stuff really quick. This is mainly where that plane change starts to happen, so take another look in that area at that assessment. I'm not going to do the whole thing here. We'll just kind of look at this one side very quickly. This kind of needs to come down a bit more based on what we're seeing. And I'll just kind of shift that plane change down a little bit more too. A lot of this feels very sculptural. I know this is kind of done in a sketcherly fashion, but I don't want to see any brush strokes in a sculpt. I don't want to see something that lets me know what brush that you used. So I would also pay attention to that. If you're if you're kind of dynameshing and sculpting up and just using some kind of square brush tube or clay tubes brush or clay brush, maybe go back through with something like a trim brush very gently, and you can start to get rid of some of the stroke that comes with that, but you won't completely get rid of the texture that you get from the brush. But it will start to give it a less kind of stroke-like feel, so you're not seeing each individual stroke happening there. In terms of your jaw, this is all Dynamesh, so it's not really easy for me to make the large form changes necessary, but from the profile, this is where this really starts to break down and fall apart. Got this jaw hanging forward and feeling very awkward. If you look at most people from the profile, you're gonna have this nice kind of flowing back for the jaw. Your jaw, and I can see the look that you're going for here. The Joker, he typically has a pretty pointy chin, but that doesn't mean that the lower lip is going to kind of like caveman-esque flow in front of the upper lip. Pretty much always the first hit is going to be on the upper lip, then the lower lip. And then the lips are just kind of lacking some definition, as well as some of the form here that you're transitioning and getting these really hard shadows in this area for these two muscles coming down off the lower lip and creating this crease here are just overdone to the point where it's not really necessary. There's quite a bit here in terms of just volume that we'd want to get rid of, and some forms here that don't really make sense or have too much of a purpose, and I'm not really seeing them in the 2D either. So I would start to play around with that, and then also just kind of working on, like your previous critique had said, starting to get this more into a smile. There's also just some definition here in our lips that we're lacking. If we look at this, it's just feeling like this really kind of rounded shape, really lacking a lot of the hits and breaks that we would expect to see in a lip. You can see like a little bit of the shadowed region for the form break. I'm not sure if this was your only reference, but it's not a great reference in terms of trying to sculpt something that is going to feel human. You're going to be lacking a lot of the stuff that you need. Your fill trim here is very deep, kind of coming in here. I would say try not to make that quite so deep, and then try not to get quite such a rounded curve coming up and around here to the lip. Feels a little awkward. And then in terms of getting away from that hanging jaw feeling, I think a lot of that is just how far forward, and I'm gonna super break this, but how far forward that that lower lip is. So starting to play with that, again, like I said, I think you can still do some kind of like crazy pointed chin if you want to try to match that a little bit better in the silhouette, but a lot of that is going to be affected by that placement of the lower lip. That plus just the overall shape of this chin being more squared. If we look at this line flowing down from the jawline up here, which is a little bit of a crazy hit. The distance here is pretty absurd. I would take another stab in this area. Just go ahead and slap your hand right here on your neck, and or maybe measure how many fingers it goes from your neck to your chin. this is a huge, huge gap here that you have going on. We'll look at the negative, just so you can make sure that you guys see this. How big of a distance that is. So it's got like this crazy break here. So I would pay attention to that, and then start kind of shaping up your jaw into that more squared, kind of planar-esque shape that we're getting there in terms of accuracy to the 2D as well as just anatomical truth. Cool, cool, cool. What else can we say? The angle of your ears needs to go up a little bit more compared to the 2D. Start playing with that. And the shape of the ear is just incorrect as well compared to what I'm seeing here. Your anti-tragus here is absolutely ginormous. And some of the shapes here are just incorrect. In terms of the depth that you're getting in here, this isn't what you would expect to see in an ear. Coming around for the helix, the anti-helix, all this stuff. I would really look at some ears and try to figure out, I think, just depth and overall width for a lot of these forms. And after you have a really good base ear, then try to match that to what you got there. For example, I actually have an insert ear brush of an ear that I sculpted. Just kind of ploop this in here. Bam! Really basic ear. I use this a lot for just kind of inserting in on top of a character, and then I'll start to shape that up a bit more. So a really good, just get a really good base here, and then start conforming to the forms that you see there. But look at some real reference, real ears. Don't use 3D reference. Don't take a screenshot of that and start using that. And I think just overall, just kind of starting to really plane out and tighten up some of the form changes that we get here. If we're looking at like this cheekbone, that silhouette there is really nice, kind of coming down from the corner of the eye, flowing back, down to the cheek, and then all the way down to before we break at the chin. Whereas with ears, we're just getting a little sloppy here, kind of all over the place. So that's something that I would probably take some time to reassess. So coming out from the eye. Oh, and another thing here I'm noticing, we want to change that angle probably quite a bit. Start to point that a little bit more up, right? So it kind of matches what we're seeing there. And I might have pushed that a little bit too far, but I think you get the idea. But just kind of coming out here, flowing down, and then all the way down to about this point of the chin. So we're just getting a lot of kind of extra noise in our silhouette, and it starts to detract away from the really nice shape that we have going on here. In terms of the extra texture here that's not really present in the 2D, I mean, I think it's fine. I think you can kind of push some of this a little bit more, though, in terms of the where this would be going. I mean, we want him to be smiling, so kind of pulling these scars up and kind of flowing up and around this direction. That way. I think will help this to feel a bit closer to what we're seeing there. And from what I can tell, it looks like they kind of end like right below that cheekbone, right around here. So I think you can continue some of these lines, but what I would recommend is think about edge quality a little bit more and start to fade these out as it flows back to that point. The scar tissue here kind of bubbled up feels a little weird. It feels more like a burn than it would like a cut. So you might want to consider actually cutting, slicing your top and lower jaw off, and then kind of figuring out how far you want those two separation points to go back. So then you can actually get that to feel a little bit more separated. If you don't know what I'm talking about, a quick demonstration. We'll just break your model completely, split that off, boom. All right, so something like this. And then if you want to connect that up to about there, and then you can start working on these two meshes separately to get that feeling a bit wider all the way back. So it feels more like it's actually cut, and then you'd want that mass of scar tissue to be probably about where they connect, not kind of just out here in no man's land on the face where it doesn't really make too much sense. It just kind of feels stuck on. But cool, I think that will be enough to get you started heading in the right direction. Again, just kind of paying attention to creating some cleaner geometry I think will help you a lot, especially down here. Try working with subdivision levels, really pay attention to the hits and breaks in your form. Start tightening up some of these plane changes, get some more depth kind of around this area in your eye. Think about the stroke and texture that you have going on here. Some of it feels very sculptural and awkward. We don't want to see a lot of those strokes towards the end. And play around with fixing those lips and jaw. You got a lot of stuff that I think you can play around with down here. But I think that'll be good to get you started, like I said. Good luck to you, and I can't wait to see what you do next with it.